4 years ago, to be exact, I found myself at Rosehearty, way up in the north of Scotland. After depositing my luggage at the only inn, and a very good inn it is, I wandered about among the fishermen's cottages for a while, till I caught sight of a grey stone house on a hill behind Rosehearty, a house in which I was particularly interested. So interested that I boldly knocked at the door and asked to see the master of the house. This turned out to be an old gentleman, retired from business, very amiable and very well up in the history of Rosehearty. He was kind enough to show me over the house. He noticed that I seemed particularly interested in an upstairs room, and I thought it only courteous to explain. You see, I said, I happened to be born in that room about 80 years ago. The old gentleman's reply was, "Dearie me, then you must be 80 years old." The Scottish mind moves slowly but with unerring logic. Of that event, my birth, important as it was to me personally, I have no recollection. I've never been psychoanalyzed. But other rooms in that house did awaken memories. Always when one looks back on one's childhood, certain moments seem to stand out with vivid intensity. For instance, the sight of the room that had been my father's study brought back, as if it had been yesterday, the morning when I was awakened by my mother's agitated voice calling out, "The house is on fire." Some smouldering newspapers had in the night burst into flame. A bookcase had caught fire. Smoke pouring from the windows had attracted the attention of some passer-by, and presently a group of fishermen were busy with ropes and buckets, saving my father's valuable theological library. I forgot to mention, by the way, that my father was a minister of the gospel and a lifelong collector of theological books. A good many volumes were destroyed by that fire, which I now find surprising, because books, as you will know if you've ever tried to burn one, are not very inflammable. I don't like to suggest that books on theology may be particularly dry. Anyhow, what I remember was not my fears for the safety of my father's books, but for the safety of my precious self. I could hear people running to and fro with buckets of water, and I felt sure that everybody had forgotten me, and that I would shortly suffer the fate of a Christian martyr. So one of my earliest recollections is this signal example of the egoism of a child. Strangely enough, the incident that most vividly recalled across a gulf of years took place not in Rosehearty, but in Arcachon, a small French town not far from Bordeaux. Is that of the 8 years of my childhood in that stone house, in that unremarkable Rosehearty, I can remember nothing that would be of breathless interest to any listener. But I do want to say one thing. I was brought up in what would nowadays be described as a puritanical household. My parents were strictly orthodox in matters of religion. The doctrines of the Kirk of Scotland were still the gloomy doctrines of John Knox. All I can say is that I can remember nothing gloomy about my childhood. People say to me sometimes, "How long did it take you to rebel against all those severe disciplines, no whistling on the Sabbath day and so on?" My answer is that I didn't rebel because I didn't see anything to rebel against. I was never told that I mustn't whistle on Sunday. It's true that my brothers and sisters never played tennis on Sunday. Certain kinds of books, including the novels of Dickens and Thackeray, were not considered fit reading for that day. It was just taken for granted that certain things were not done on Sunday. But the gloomy Scottish Sabbath, well, all I can say from memory is that Sunday was a happier day for young people when I was a child than it is today. There was a certain graciousness about it, a serenity, a luminous peace that was an infinite refreshment of the spirit. Even a child could feel that. Another thing I want to mention is that I was brought up among a race of heroes. My father's parishioners were mostly fishermen, and their wives and families. I remember well going down to the harbour to see the fishing fleet come home. I remember the look as of burnished silver when the hatches were removed. It was not silver, it was tons of herring, caller herring, as the old song called it. I've forgotten every verse of that song except one. While by caller herring, oh, ye may ca' them vulgar faring, wives and mithers mist despairing, ca' them lives of men. Lives of men indeed they were. The North Sea, on which these tall, black-bearded men plied their trade, was a place of terrible storms. And these heroes, when they put out to sea in their small boats, very different from the big steam luggers of today, took their lives in their hands. It was a hard, precarious way of earning a rather bare livelihood. The big fish-curing firms got most of the profits, but of course I knew nothing about that as a child. I only knew that it was a great thing to be patted on the head by one of those splendid men. One other incident I want to mention in honor of an old nurse of mine who must have been dead these many years. Indeed, when she was my nurse, she seemed to me incredibly old. She may have been 40. At any rate, I was 4, and she used to tell me a story before I went to sleep. One night she told me a wonderful story of a man who borrowed money from a wicked money lender on condition that if he couldn't pay the money a due date, the lender would have a pound of his flesh. In the end, the man couldn't pay, and the money lender had a sharp knife ready to take a pound of flesh when he was suddenly warned that he must take the flesh out without shedding a drop of the man's blood, which of course even a money lender couldn't do. It was many years later that I read The Merchant of Venice and found that Shakespeare had borrowed the story from my old nurse. It's still a puzzle to me where she got that tale. I don't think she could read at all, and I'm very sure she had never read Shakespeare. Possibly the story came down the centuries as an old wives' tale. Anyhow, I'm glad to bring a touch of culture into this talk with the name of Shakespeare and to couple it with the name of my old nurse, Barbara Ritchie. I'm setting out to